being au naturel a little bit, that you are not so much perfect when it comes to se raser, I don't know, shaving and so on, that you can be a little bit in disarray. And that maybe it comes from the ancient times, because the Romans have perceived that the Celtic, the Celts which were in the Gaul and the Gauls, they tend to be a little bit, you know, with the beards and so on, and they were not shaved, and they also like to shock the enemy by putting butter into the hair, for instance. So maybe it's because of that. Maybe it's because the French like to perceive themselves as natural, but at the same time sometimes they like to think about themselves as sophisticated, so there is a constant tension between those two. Because it's also the country of the Louvre, of the good manners, invented mostly in 17th century on the French court, so it had to be invented. The rudeness was the normal thing, and being cultivated and educated was a new thing. Having appetite on other nations' territory, it's a French thing. The French were that's true. It was here mentioned during the lectures by the students as a controversial characteristic of the French nations. The French King Louis XIV have invented this method of invading the territory to which he was not entitled at all. It was something new. Believe me, it was not a common thing. For instance, when Frederick invaded Silesia, Frederick of Prussia, Frederick II of Prussia, the king, was invading Silesia, the Austrian territory, he had the real legal pretensions to like 2/5, to like 40% of its territory. So he had some legal pretenses, and he was partly entitled to this territory. But it was not the case of the French, and the French have never really thought about it. So they just wanted to be the number one. And when Germany was divided in so many states, as it was in the 17th, 18th, and 19th, most of the 19th centuries, so it was normal that the French should be number one. And they also they always had the biggest land army, as they have today, by the way. So it was a natural thing to do. They just want to take something, so they take something. So it was so the aggressiveness. It's true, and it's also part that the people part of it. It comes from the fact that the nations which are not separated from other nations by natural like mountains or something, like the Italians are and the Spaniards are, usually are more aggressive. So the Carpathian nations, the Iberian nations, the ones that live on the other side of the Pyrenees, and also the Italians, they tend to be less aggressive than, for instance, French, Germans, Poles, Russians, which all live in open spaces, and they must be aggressive because they have no natural borders. Of course, the French are sometimes identified with the Napoleon also, although Napoleon is not very French in everything what he was doing. He was very much Corsican in what he was doing. For instance, when the French Napoleonic army captured an officer, for instance, Russian officer, Napoleon would want to question him very brutally, and it was not a French thing to do. And there were many quarrels between French generals and Napoleon. Napoleon and all the Bonapartes were seen a little bit as barbaric in France, so it was not very French thing to do. And it was also not very French thing to do to follow Napoleon, because take any date you would like, you would see that France was like following Napoleon, supporting Napoleon in 50%, not more, never more. So